The sun was shining brightly over London that morning, the kind of summer day that made the city feel alive and welcoming. Tourists filled the streets, carrying cameras, wearing backpacks, and moving with excitement toward the landmarks they had dreamed of seeing. Among them was a young man named Mark. He had saved for months to take this trip and had planned every stop carefully. Buckingham Palace was right at the top of his list. It wasn't just the beauty of the palace that attracted him. He had seen countless videos online of people visiting the famous Queen's Guards. He wanted to witness them in person. Mark had always been fascinated by the idea of soldiers who could stand perfectly still for hours, showing no emotion and never reacting, no matter what happened around them. He had read somewhere that they were highly trained and that their role was more than just ceremonial. Still, a part of him also thought it would be fun to test them just a little, and maybe get a reaction for a short video. His friends back home loved prank videos, and he imagined how many likes and comments he could get if he managed to make one of the guards move or speak. When he reached the palace, the scene was even more beautiful than he had imagined. The massive gates shone under the sunlight, their golden details gleaming. Behind them stood the palace itself, grand and majestic, its white facade stretching proudly against the blue sky. But what caught Mark's attention most was the figure in a red tunic, black trousers, and tall bearskin hat. The guard stood so still he almost looked like a statue, his rifle resting upright at his side, his eyes fixed straight ahead. A crowd had gathered near the gates, keeping a respectful distance. Families were taking group photos, couples were smiling for selfies, and children were pointing in awe at the guard's uniform. People spoke in hushed voices as if they were in a museum. Mark, however, was already thinking about how he could make this visit more memorable. He held his phone in his hand, making sure the camera was ready. His plan was simple: walk up close, say something funny, maybe wave his hand in front of the guard's face, and see what happened. He moved through the crowd slowly, pretending at first to just be another tourist admiring the scene, but his eyes stayed locked on the guard. There was something almost unreal about the way the soldier didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't show even the smallest reaction. It made Mark even more determined. In his mind, this wasn't just about fun anymore. It was a challenge. Mark found a spot right in front of the guard, just outside the black and gold railings. He switched his phone to record and began to narrate in a playful voice for his followers. "Here we are," he whispered to the camera. "The world-famous Queen's Guard. They say they never move, never smile, never even talk. Let's see." If that's true, the people nearby started to notice what he was doing. Some gave him quick glances, a few shaking their heads. One older woman in the crowd muttered to her husband, "I hope he doesn't cause trouble." But Mark wasn't paying attention to anyone else. He was focused only on the guard and his camera. The warm breeze carried the distant sound of traffic and the chatter of other tourists, but right in front of the palace gates it felt oddly quiet. The guard stood motionless, his chin slightly lifted, the sunlight catching the polished buttons of his tunic. Mark felt a strange mix of excitement and curiosity. It was almost unbelievable that a real person could remain so still while being watched by hundreds of people every day. Still, Mark didn't stop to think about why the guard was there, or what his job truly meant. In his mind, this was just a harmless moment of fun. He took a small step forward, leaning closer toward the railings, and spoke a little louder. "Hey there, soldier. Nice hat you've got." Daya. He chuckled quietly, waiting for even the tiniest flicker of reaction.
Nothing
Happened. The guard didn't blink, didn't shift his eyes, didn't even twitch a finger. Mark grinned to himself. "All right, you're good," he said, still speaking into the phone. "Let's see if we can make you laugh." He waved his free hand slowly in front of the guard's face, careful not to actually touch him. Still nothing. This only made him more eager to keep trying. In the crowd, a few people were now whispering to each other, some taking out their phones to record what Mark was doing. A young couple nearby looked uncomfortable, exchanging glances as if to say, should someone stop him? But nobody spoke up. For Mark, the moment felt thrilling. The palace, the crowd, the camera, it was like being on stage, he thought. About how he would post the video later, adding funny captions and maybe some music. The thought of all those views and comments filled him with energy. He took another slow step forward, now standing almost at the very edge of where visitors were allowed. From where he stood, he could see the fine details of the guard's uniform, the crisp lines of the red jacket, the perfectly polished metal of the buttons, the black strap of the bearskin hat running under the guard's chin. He noticed the guard's hands gripping the rifle, fingers still but firm. For just a moment, Mark felt a small wave of respect for the discipline it must take to stand there so perfectly still. But then he quickly brushed it aside, telling himself he was just having a bit of fun. The crowd shifted slightly as more tourists arrived, some trying to get a better view of the palace. The quiet murmur of voices filled the air again, but Mark's attention stayed locked on the guard. He raised his eyebrows toward the camera and whispered, "All right, this is it. I'm going to make him blink." As he leaned in a little more, he didn't notice that his foot was inching closer to a small, almost invisible line on the ground. It was a subtle change in the stone's color, something most tourists didn't even see. But for the guards, it marked a clear boundary, a space that must not be crossed. At that moment, Mark still felt completely in control. To him, the guard was just part of a performance, and he was playing along. The idea that something could go wrong never crossed his mind. He was in London, at one of the most famous landmarks in the world, with the perfect summer weather and an audience watching. Everything felt light and harmless, but just beyond that quiet confidence, there was an unseen line of respect and duty, one that Mark was about to step dangerously close to without realizing it. The day was still young, the crowd still cheerful, but in just a few minutes, the mood around Buckingham Palace was going to change. And when it did, Mark would discover that the Queen's Guard wasn't there for entertainment alone. They were there for a purpose, and that purpose would soon make itself very clear. Mark's phone was still recording, the small red circle flashing in the corner of the screen. He could already imagine himself watching this clip later, adding captions and sharing it online. His voice was playful as he kept talking toward the camera. Still nothing. He's like a robot. Let's see if we can make him move. The crowd around him was changing. At first, some people had smiled, thinking Mark was just a tourist having fun. But now, a few faces were starting to look less amused. An older man in a flat cap stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head slightly. A woman nearby pulled her child a little closer, whispering something about showing respect. Even so, there were still a few people who laughed quietly, waiting to see what Mark would try next. Mark, however, was only paying attention to the guard. He took a half step forward, leaning in with exaggerated curiosity. "Do you blink? Do you talk? What if I tell you a joke?" he said, his voice carrying over the quiet hum of the crowd. He then began mimicking the guard's stiff stance, planting his feet apart and raising his chin high, trying to copy every detail. He puffed out his chest, pretending to be serious. The crowd chuckled softly, but there was also a ripple of discomfort. One man in the back muttered under his breath, "He's going too far." A woman next to him replied, "They're soldiers, not statues. You can't just mess with them." But Mark didn't hear any of this. In his mind, the moment was too good to waste. He walked a few steps along the railing, making slow circles around the spot in front of the guard. Then, with a sudden grin, he leaned toward his phone again. "I'm going to get really close," he whispered. "This is it. The internet is going to love this." As he moved closer to the edge of the marked area, he could see the guard's face more clearly under the shadow of the tall black bearskin hat. The soldier's eyes were focused straight ahead, his expression fixed. His jawline was tense, but it was impossible to tell if that was from the heat of the sun, the weight of his uniform, or the fact that someone was standing so close. Mark raised his hand and began waving slowly, just inches from the guard's face. "Hello? Anybody home?" he teased. There was no response. The guard's gaze didn't flicker, not even for a second. That's when Mark decided to push things further. He stepped right up to the invisible line on the ground without realizing it. His left foot edged forward, resting just over the faint change in the stone's color, a boundary that marked the guard's protected space. To the trained eyes of the guard, that step meant something very different. Tourists could laugh, take photos, and speak from behind the line all they wanted. But the moment someone crossed into that restricted space, it was no longer harmless. It became an issue of security. Mark still didn't notice. He was too focused on his own voice, and the way the camera was capturing every second. "You know, I could probably make you smile if I tried harder," he said with a laugh. He tilted his head, looking the guard up and down as if sizing him up. Several people in the crowd had already noticed his foot crossing the line. A man holding a guidebook said quietly to his friend, "He's in trouble now." Another person began recording with their own phone, not because they supported Mark, but because they suspected something was about to happen. The warm London air seemed to grow heavier in that moment. The background chatter faded, and a kind of stillness settled over the scene. Then, without warning, the guard's voice broke the silence. "Stand back." The sound was sharp and commanding, echoing against the stone walls of the palace. It was so loud and sudden that several people in the crowd jumped. Mark froze in place, startled. The voice was nothing like the quiet, ceremonial atmosphere he had been expecting. It was strong, deep, and unmistakably serious. Mark's eyes widened. And for a split second, he considered stepping back, but pride, mixed with the thought of being filmed, made him hesitate. He laughed nervously, looking into his phone. "Oh, he talks," said, as if trying to turn the moment into a joke. The guard didn't move right away, but his eyes seemed to sharpen, locking onto Mark, with the kind of focus that made the young tourist's smile falter. "Stand back," the guard repeated, louder this time. It wasn't a request, it was an order. This time, the guard took a single, precise step forward. His boots hit the ground with a solid thud, and his rifle, which had been resting upright at his side, was now held with more visible control. The movement was small, but powerful, and it sent a clear message. This was no longer part of a game. The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps rippled through the group, and some people stepped back, themselves as though they were the ones being addressed. A few in the front row lowered their cameras, while others continued filming with wide-eyed anticipation. Mark's phone wavered in his hand. He was still smiling, but it was the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to hide discomfort. All right, he muttered into the camera, but he didn't move right away. The guard's stance, however, made it clear that this situation would only end one way. The tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Even the birds that had been chirping nearby seemed to have gone silent. Mark glanced at the crowd and saw several people shaking their heads. The fun, playful mood from earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding among the onlookers that Mark had crossed a line. Finally, with a small shrug, he stepped back over the invisible boundary. The guard, without breaking his rigid posture, took a step back to his original position. His eyes fixed forward again, as though nothing had happened. But for Mark, the energy of the moment had shifted. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, not with admiration, but with disapproval. The crowd's murmurs returned, and this time they weren't amused. He caught bits of sentences. "That was rude. He's lucky, that's all that happened. People don't understand the rules here." Mark lowered his phone slightly, still recording but feeling less proud of the footage than he had a few minutes earlier. The guard remained motionless once again, as if the interruption had never occurred. Yet for Mark, the soldier's brief movement and commanding voice had left a lasting impression. What had started as a playful idea for a social media clip had just turned into something very different. He didn't know it yet. There was still the crowd's reaction, the police presence nearby, and the sudden realization that not all attention is good attention. What had felt like a harmless bit of fun was quickly becoming a lesson he hadn't planned on learning. And as the palace gates stood quietly behind the guard, gleaming in the summer sun, Mark would soon discover that sometimes the person who thinks they're in control of the moment isn't in control at all. Mark still had his phone in his hand, but his grip had tightened without him realizing it. His fingers felt slightly clammy, and the small screen seemed heavier than it had a moment ago. The guard's deep, commanding voice still echoed in his head. "Stand back," like a sharp clap in an otherwise quiet room. For the first time since he had stepped up to the railing, he felt a flicker of doubt. He told himself it was fine. After all, he had stepped back. The guard had returned to his position. Surely that was the end of it. The moment had been caught. On video, and in his mind, it could still be edited to look entertaining. But deep down, he could sense that something had changed. The playful energy had vanished. The crowd no longer looked curious or amused. Most of them looked uncomfortable, some even annoyed. Still, instead of walking away, Mark lingered. He tried to laugh lightly, hoping to shake off the awkwardness. "Wow, they really do speak," he said toward his camera, but his voice didn't sound as confident as before. His smile was tight, and the edges of his bravado were beginning to fray. From behind him, someone said, "Mate, you should probably move on." Mark didn't turn to look. He wasn't used to being told what to do by strangers, and his pride didn't let him respond. But the words stuck in his mind. Move on, he probably should. Yet a stubborn part of him thought, "No, I'm not leaving looking like I got scared." He glanced back at the guard, who was once again as still as a statue. The sun was catching the polished buttons on the soldier's tunic, making them shine. The guard's boots were planted firmly on the ground, his rifle upright and steady. If not for what had just happened, Mark might have doubted that the guard had moved or spoken at all. It was as if the last few seconds had been erased, like a sudden ripple on a calm lake that had now smoothed over again. Mark took a slow breath, telling himself he could salvage the situation. He would make one more small joke, maybe smile for the camera, then walk away on his own terms. That way, it wouldn't look like he had been chased off. He leaned slightly forward, careful this time not to cross the line. "You're good at your job," he said under his breath. "But I'm better at mine." He didn't realize that even speaking too close could draw attention. Just a few feet to the left, a police officer in a dark uniform had been watching the entire exchange. The officer had been standing near the crowd for crowd control purposes, but now his focus was squarely on Mark. The officer began walking toward him, not in a rush, but with a steady, deliberate pace. The people in the crowd noticed first. A few heads turned and phones quietly lifted higher. Now recording both Mark and the approaching officer, Mark saw the movement in his peripheral vision and quickly glanced over. The sight of the uniform made his pulse quicken. The officer's face was calm but serious. It's a kind of expression that said this wasn't going to be a friendly chat, sir. The officer said firmly when he reached the railing. "I'm going to ask you to step back from the guard and stop interfering with his duties." Mark swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. "I wasn't interfering," he said quickly, his voice a little defensive. "I was just having some fun." The officer's eyes didn't soften. "This isn't entertainment," he replied evenly. "The guards are on active duty. They're protecting this post. You can take photos and admire from a distance, but you cannot step into their space, distract them, or treat them like a joke. It's a matter of respect and security." The words landed heavily. The crowd was silent now, leaning in to hear. Mark could feel the eyes on him from every direction. His cheeks warmed under the attention. For the first time since arriving at the palace, he realized how he must look to everyone else. Not clever, not brave, but rude. He tried to laugh it off, but it came out awkwardly. All right. I'll stop," he said, taking a small step back. The officer nodded once, but his gaze stayed steady. "Good. I suggest you enjoy the palace like everyone else here. There's plenty to see without crossing boundaries." Mark nodded, but his mind was spinning. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction. In all those viral videos he had watched, the people messing with the guards had seemed to get away with it. Some had even been applauded. But here, in real life, with real people around him, it wasn't entertaining. It was tense, uncomfortable, and strangely humbling. He finally lowered his phone completely, letting his arm fall to his side. The crowd began to relax again, shifting their focus back to the palace. Some put away their phones. Others continued taking pictures of the guards from a respectful distance, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling in his chest, a mix of embarrassment, regret, and stubborn pride. He wanted to leave, but walking away felt like admitting defeat. So instead, he stood off to the side for a few minutes, pretending to look at the palace gates. even though he wasn't really seeing them. The guard, as if nothing had happened, remained perfectly still. His discipline was almost unreal, and for the first time, Mark began to appreciate just how much control that took. The heat of the sun, the weight of the uniform, the steady grip on the rifle, all while ignoring the constant flow of tourists, noises, and distractions. It wasn't just a job. It was a role that demanded respect. Yet the moment still burned in his mind, the sudden booming voice, the crowd's stares, the officer's words. He knew those clips from the people in the crowd would probably end up online and in them. He wouldn't be the clever tourist making people laugh. He would be the one being told off, looking uncomfortable under the summer sun. He sighed quietly, wishing he had handled things differently. But the lesson wasn't fully learned yet. There was still the rest of the day and the reactions from the online world, waiting to drive the point home. For now, though, he stayed still, letting the scene return to its calm rhythm. Tourists, clicking cameras, the palace standing grand and silent, and the Queen's guard, unmoved, unshaken, and unbothered by the moment that had just passed. Little did Mark know, the real impact of his actions would follow him long after he left those gates. The warm summer air at Buckingham Palace was still filled with the gentle hum of tourists chatting and camera shutters clicking. But for Mark, the atmosphere felt different now. The light-hearted thrill that had brought him up to the railing earlier was gone. In its place was a faint heaviness, like a shadow following him. He could still hear the guard's voice in his head, that sudden sharp stand back, and the officer's calm but firm reminder about respect and duty. He told himself he would stay for just a few more minutes, maybe capture a couple of ordinary photos, and then leave. That way it would look like he was still enjoying the palace rather than walking away embarrassed. But as he lingered, he could feel the crowd's attention drifting toward him again, not the curious, playful attention he'd imagined when he first arrived, but something sharper. A few people were whispering in small groups, glancing his way from time to time. Others still had their phones out, some clearly rewatching the clips they had just filmed. Mark had a sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew that whatever those videos showed, it wasn't going to paint him in the best light. He stood near the railing, trying to act as if nothing had happened, but his mind kept replaying the scene. The booming voice, the step forward, the rifle angled with sudden authority. The guard had made his point without breaking a sweat. Then he heard a small group behind him talking in low voices. Was he the one? A woman asked. Her friend replied. He was waving in the guard's face. Can't do that. Another voice chimed in. It's disrespectful. These guys are real soldiers. Mark's ears burned. He pretended not to hear, keeping his gaze on the palace. But his jaw tightened. He didn't want to admit it, but the sting of being judged by strangers was worse than the guard shouting. Not far away, a man in a blue shirt was showing his phone screen to a couple of people. From the angle, Mark knew it was a video. Laughed softly, not the friendly kind of laugh that invites you to join in, the kind that makes you feel like the joke is on you. Mark shifted uncomfortably. He tried to focus on the grand architecture of the palace. The white stone gleamed in the sunlight. The golden crests on the gates caught the light. And the guards stood like symbols of tradition and history. It should have been a moment to admire and appreciate. But for Mark, the beauty of the place was now tangled with his own mistake. The police officer from earlier was still nearby, his presence a silent reminder to behave. Wasn't watching Mark directly, but every so often, his eyes swept the crowd, making sure nothing else crossed the line. Then it happened. A small ripple of laughter moved through a section of the crowd, and Mark's stomach tightened. A young teenager with a bright red cap was pointing in his direction while talking to his friends. They were looking at him the same way you look at someone in a viral video, half amused. Half surprised, Mark turned slightly, trying to look unfazed, but the damage was done. The quiet, watchful attention of the people around him felt heavier now. Like a spotlight he couldn't turn off. One man standing close to the railing muttered just loud enough for others to hear. That's what happens when you mess with the guards, another replied. Some people don't understand respect. This isn't a theme park. Mark wanted to say something to defend himself, but he knew that anything he said now would only make him look worse. His earlier confidence had drained away. leaving only an awkward tension in his chest. The guard, meanwhile, hadn't moved an inch since returning to his post. His face was still, his body motionless, his rifle steady. It was almost as if that earlier incident had never happened, at least for him. That quiet composure somehow made Mark feel even smaller. He finally decided it was time to leave. As he stepped back from the railing, a few people's eyes followed him. Some had that look of satisfaction, the kind you get when someone who crossed the line finally walks away. Others looked at him with mild disappointment, as though they had expected better. But before he could make his way fully out of the crowd, he heard someone call out in a joking tone, "Hey, don't get too close to the next guard." A few people chuckled. Mark forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He walked toward the edge of the palace grounds. The ornate gates behind him, but the embarrassment followed him like a shadow. Even the sound of footsteps on the stone pathway seemed louder. In his ears, as if the whole place was echoing his mistake, by the time he reached the outer street, he pulled out his phone to check the video he had recorded. At first, he watched it with the mindset of editing it for laughs. But as the clip played, his stomach sank further. From his camera's perspective, it was clear he looked like someone bothering a soldier who was simply doing his job. The moment the guard shouted was sharp and commanding.
"I."
And instead of looking clever, Mark looked startled and out of place. He imagined how the clip would look when others posted their versions, angles he couldn't control. With the crowds, murmurs in the background. He could already picture the captions, "Tourist gets told off by the Queen's Guard," or "Don't mess with soldiers at Buckingham Palace." Mark slipped his phone back into his pocket. The heat of the day felt heavier now, not just from the sun, but from the weight of regret pressing down on him. He thought about the officer's words. Again, this isn't entertainment. At the time, he had brushed them off, but now they made more sense. The guards weren't actors playing a role. They were trained soldiers, representing something far bigger than themselves. As he made his way down the busy London street away from the palace, the laughter and chatter of other tourists faded into the background. He realized that sometimes the biggest lessons don't come from books or classrooms. They come from moments like this. Moments where pride gets in the way, and you have to face the consequences in front of strangers. Mark knew he wouldn't forget that voice. It's the single sharp step forward, or the way the crowd had turned on him. And while he still had days left in London, he also knew one thing for sure. There were some boundaries you didn't cross. Not for a joke, not for a video, not for anything. Mark sat quietly in his small hotel room that evening, the soft hum of the city outside his window, a calm contrast to the storm of thoughts in his mind. The events of the day played over and over like a loop in his head. What had started as a simple visit to Buckingham Palace had turned into a moment he never expected. A moment that taught him more than any guidebook or travel video ever could. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the video clips he had recorded. At first, the footage had seemed funny and exciting, him teasing the guard, making faces, trying to get a reaction. But now, watching with fresh eyes, the tone felt very different. Instead of laughter, the clip showed tension. His own voice sounded brash and careless. The guard's serious face and the sharp command echoed loudly through the silence. The comments from his friends and followers popped up as he checked social media. Some laughed, calling it hilarious, but many more criticized him for being rude and disrespectful. People he didn't even know wrote that he should have known better, that the Queen's Guard deserved respect, not mockery. The words stung. But deep down, Mark knew they were right. He thought back to the moment the guard took that single step forward. The way the crowd had suddenly shifted from friendly to disapproving, it was a clear message that some traditions, some roles, were not to be treated like a game. The guard was not just a man in a fancy uniform, he was a symbol of duty, discipline, and history. Mark realized how little he had understood before. That day, he had seen the guards as statues, objects for entertainment, not as real people with real responsibility. It was easy to forget, especially in the rush of travel and the desire to capture every moment on camera. But respect wasn't just about rules, it was about recognizing the meaning behind those rules. He smiled softly, shaking his head at himself. The lesson had come unexpectedly and in a way he never imagined. He thought about the officer who had spoken to him calmly, explaining the importance of the guard's duties. That voice of authority, firm but fair, had cut through his own stubbornness. Mark knew he would carry that lesson with him beyond London.
Ow!
It was a reminder that culture, history, and respect are deeply connected. What might seem like a harmless joke in one place could be a serious offense in another. And sometimes, the line between fun and disrespect is thinner than you think. He also thought about the crowd, the strangers who had watched, judged, and recorded the moment. They had not turned against him to be cruel. They had responded because they cared about something bigger than just a tourist's prank. They cared about preserving dignity, tradition, and honor. In the quiet of his room, Mark made a promise to himself. Next time he traveled, he would be more thoughtful. He would observe first, learn the meaning behind what he saw, and show kindness. To the people who made those places special, respect would come before fun, understanding before entertainment. His phone buzzed with a new message. It was from a friend back home, joking. "So, did the Queen's Guard finally crack a smile?" Mark laughed softly. "Not quite," he typed back. The day's adventure had ended, not with a funny video, but with a deep lesson in humility and respect. And that was worth more than any number of likes or shares. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, and Mark felt ready to face whatever came next, wiser, quieter, and with a new appreciation for the world around him.